All right, we are now on our third value of We Are Church. We've been going through the values one at a time through the rest of the year as like global We Are Church spread out around the world. And each of our churches, one, the leaders are going through these videos, and then as a church, we go through a video from Francis each month to really think intentionally about the values. What is it that we're pursuing? And so here we wanted to talk about the third value, quick disciple makers. And so at the core of what we're trying to say there is that we believe that God has called the body of Christ to function in a way where the leaders are not the ones who are doing everything, but are more equipping the body for the work of ministry. And that's what we see in Ephesians 4. And that's what we also see modeled in Jesus. Jesus was, I mean, if he is actually the center of the church, right? In a way that we are definitely not. Yet even still, his posture was to train his disciples, to empower them, to see them not just sitting under his teaching alone, but also that they would be going out and teaching others, that they would start taking responsibility for others. And that all of his disciples, he had that expectation that they would be doing it as well, not just passively receiving from him. And that's at like the very core of when he would call people to follow him. He, in different ways would lay out like, you need to understand that I have expectations of you if you're going to be my disciple. He called them to pick up their cross and follow him. He sent out the disciples a couple different times to go do the work, go do the ministry. And then, of course, we have the Great Commission at the very end of Matthew's gospel, where he's telling all of his disciples to go and make disciples. Who will make disciples, right? Teaching them to obey all that he's commanded. One of those commands being to make disciples. And so this is for all believers. And this is how Jesus led, and this is what he wants for the church. But as we think about within We Are Church, we have to ask a question. As leaders, do we see ourselves primarily as equippers of the body, or do we maybe primarily see ourselves as the ones who do everything? And maybe everything's too strong of a word, but just tend to like run everything and organize things. And do we see ourselves as the one who's doing stuff on behalf of the church? And obviously we're called to serve, but one of the beautiful ways we get to serve is to see ourselves as an equiper, as a coach, as somebody who's helping people step into the fullness of what God has called them to do and to be. And if we aren't doing that, we're going to create a consumer culture in our homes. And there's a very big mistake we can make where just because we're meeting in homes, we think, oh, we're doing it different. And that's not necessarily true. And we can create a consumer culture if we are viewing ourselves as the one who needs to do everything or do the majority of things. So there's a couple of reasons we might drift away from this. And I want us as We Are Church leaders to be thinking about why might we drift? Well, there's a tendency in our culture to see like we want to outsource things to experts and professionals to take responsibility of different things. Fixing plumbing in my house, I want to find a plumber. To fix, a roof leak, I need to get a roofer. So to find somebody who can make disciples, I need a pastor. I need somebody who's like a professional Christian who is like trained and equipped to be able to do that. And so we have to intentionally make sure we are creating a culture in the church that like pushes up against that. No, we're all called to make disciples. Like not everybody has to fix their plumbing or fix their roof, but we are all called to make disciples. That's something that's very different. Another thing as leaders, we tend to like to be needed. And so if we're not careful, we can start to make it too much about us. And that's at like the core of, I guess, like one of like a big issue right now in the church is that churches have become too much about one leader or a couple leaders. And we need to make sure the focus is not on us, but we are pushing the ministry out, that we are releasing. And I think part of the challenge in that is it's scary. It can feel like it's going to be more clean. And if we have more experience as a leader, we might think it's going to be better if we just do it. But my experience would say, and I would say the Bible teaches in a lot of different ways, that as we see others step into their gifts, that it makes something so much more beautiful. And so it can be scary though, to release things, to call other people to step in different ways. but it is so important for the health of the church. So we have to think about our leadership in terms of equipping others. And, there's different ways we've developed this. Maybe Rob, you could share a little bit about what has that looked like historically in We Are Church, methods, training, trying to make sure that we are equipping others to make disciples, take care of others.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'll share maybe some of the experience for me, how I was developed as a We Are Church pastor, went through the pastor in training. Um, so this is probably not new information for you guys, but I really believe repeating stuff is super helpful because as new people come in, especially pastors in training and pastors, like you get 3 or 4 generations out and you kind of forget the basics and the original way of why and how things were done. And it's good for things to change in season, but there's some things that kind of should stay the same, I think. And so some of these things, not all of them, I think were really helpful and they might be ways to reproduce, and to help make equipped disciple makers. So the training that I went through was very relational, highly, highly relational. And when they asked me into train me to make disciples, they had already been giving me little responsibilities to do that, to already be making disciples. But when I came into a Sunday morning before church gathering training, which was like at 7 a.m. in San Francisco, We Are Church, uh, there was the, I guess, practice of theology would be taught for 2 to 3 months or maybe longer. And that would mean we would go through a book together as a group of pastors in training and pastors and elders. And we'd create dialogue around theology, different doctrines and things like that. Different books were used. It was really helpful for me, helped form me, even though I had a little bit of a, seminary in prison, not college, but prison. Uh, I had a little bit of seminary experience there, but just really diving into conversation around theological topics and seeing where people stood and where we were at as we were at church was really helpful for me. So theology, and then we went through spiritual formation for a season. And that was like books like I don't know, celebrations of discipline and just, books that kind of formed you. And it was really good, you know, talking through those things and creating dialogue amongst leaders. And then the last thing we would do was practical tools for ministry. And so that's what they explained to me. Here's the training, theology, practical tools for ministry, spiritual formation. And we go through that through the year. Not perfectly. Sometimes we deviate or whatever, but just about every Sunday we do that before the gathering. And it was helpful, but realized that, that was part of the training, but was really, really helpful for me in training was them giving me opportunities without me realizing it to go ahead and lead prayer gatherings and discipleship, and then eventually a Sunday gathering, and then eventually inviting me into, counseling conversation with people in the churches, like when there's conflict and things of that nature. So that was kind of like the on the job training, learning how to pastor. And it wasn't even just about pastoring, it was more about making sure that I'm learning how to pass things on to other people, especially making room, kind of like Sean was talking about, where it all doesn't bottleneck on the pastor. So, we use the acronym that, We Are Church has been doing this for a long time. We just kind of learned the acronym from another group of people that they use: model, assist, watch, and then leave. So model, you lead and you let others see how you do it. And then eventually you identify who the next equipped disciple maker or pastor in training will be. And you invite them deeper into, and you assist them to do it. So you model it, you assist them. That means you're sharing responsibility now. Now, sometimes I lead, sometimes you lead, and I coach while you lead. I'm assisting you. And then eventually they just watched me lead. They just gave me some pointers afterwards, but I was responsible for most of the gatherings and then raising up other leaders. And then when I raised up another leader, that leader would then leave and multiply. And so this is leaning a little bit towards the practice of multiplication, but that was some of the training and some of the methodology that was really helpful. But I would say you can't necessarily like, it's not all strategy or tools. It's a lot of it is relationship. That's what we see with Jesus is that he spent a lot of time with his guys. You know, for being with them for 3 years, it was like really significant to be with them all the time. I was reading this book the other day that he talked about even in his alone prayer time with his father, he would take them with him and say, "Hey, wait for me and watch while I pray." So very, very much always with them. So that's another thing that was really helpful for me is I got to watch how people lived. You know, they invited me into their lives, and it wasn't just like a coffee meetup or a once a week discipleship group. It was actually inviting me into life and family so that I could watch how they do things. And then I could do the same with somebody else or a few other people and ask them to do the same with others. So that was some of the training that I received and some of the modeling and some of the rhythms of training and stuff like that. So it was really helpful for me as a I was maybe 4 years into being a believer and I met the Lord in prison. So I didn't have much church background, you know? So this was really helpful for me and I still use it. I train people the same way. I use them all. I use the different theology, spiritual formation, and practical tools. I still use all that stuff.
Yep. That's good. Yeah. I think that that mall is really helpful for all of us as we are church leaders and anybody else that might be listening to this to think intentionally about right now. Who are you intentionally modeling leadership? I think that's probably the easiest one, but you might not, it's easy as a leader to not think about it that way, right? We just think, oh, I'm leading, I'm leading. But it's important to think about, no, no, no. Yes, you're leading, but also part of what you're doing is trying to model something that people would be able to catch so that you can put them in a spot to be able to take some steps in leading too, where you assist them. So what might that look like? Just to picture that right now. Who is it that you should be identifying who you can ask to step up in certain ways? And how could you assist them in that? How could you help them? Right. Because I think a lot of times what I've seen happen within house church multiplication and we are church is okay, there's a guy who's leading for 2 or 3 years. And then all of a sudden he looks at another guy who's like, hey, you've been faithful. I want you to be a pastor. We're going to multiply. And you've just gone from like model to leave. And that is just, that's too much. Like that's a whiplash. Like people don't feel ready when you do that. So you've got to give them opportunity to start stepping in where you're helping them. You're walking with them. Like, like a little kid trying to learn to ride the bike. You don't just like throw them out there. Like you're holding the seat and you're helping them along the way. And then you're watching. And if they fall, you're there to catch them or you're there to, help them up. But then eventually they've got it. And so that takes time and that's a very intentional process. So for you to be thinking right now, who are some of those people? Not just even in pastoring, leading gatherings, but like in discipleship. Like that's a huge part of what we're getting at, equip disciple makers. Are you trying to disciple everybody or have you identified other people who can disciple others? And how do we create a culture in the church where everybody understands they have something to contribute in speaking into others, in loving others? For within my church, that's look like discipleship groups. So we try to, how we lead our groups is everybody speaking in, right? I'm not the one who's always giving counsel. Like I want other people to speak into each other's lives. I want people to get used to understanding I am needed to invest in this guy. Like, I need to ask the Lord to give me wisdom to speak into so-and-so's life. I'm going to have something to contribute here. I'm not just a passive recipient. And so we have to think intentionally about this culture because it is really easy to lose this culture and have it be where people just settle in and expect the couple leaders to do everything. And it's hard to get that culture back. It's hard to shift that culture. Now, if you found that that's where you're at, we got to make some drastic moves potentially, because it's really important to not have the culture where just one person's leading and everybody else is just passively receiving. And so, because people over time, I've noticed they start to settle into roles. They start to get used to things over time. Even people that are hungry to lead, maybe they're like, man, I feel like I have something to contribute. But if they aren't given opportunity over time, they'll either like get rebellious, or they'll just kind of like pull back and go, you know what, I don't want to be rebellious, so I'm just going to sit back and I'm not going to say anything. And they'll just learn to essentially like sit in a pew, even if they're in a living room, right? Where they just pull back and they're not actually contributing. And that's what they've gotten used to. That's what the culture has communicated to them. That's what's been modeled, is this is what you do. So we need to create a new culture. This is what you do. You contribute and you call people up, and you don't always have all the answers, and you let other people speak in, and you ask other people to lead, and you ask people to take steps. So, but now to maybe transition into like more of an outward. So we're talking a lot about like raising up leaders, people contributing in the body, but also what we want to be doing is creating a culture of people taking steps of faith outward. And Francis used the analogy of like a zoo, right? He talked about visiting a church in Brazil, and the pastor saying, "Man, my church feels like a zoo," and he compared it to Madagascar, where you got these animals that have been domesticated, and they're just used to getting everything. All the food gets brought to them, and they eat it, and it seems awesome in some ways because they don't have to work. But in Madagascar, it's about these animals that end up wanting to break out and go out into the wild, but they're not equipped. They're not ready because they've been domesticated. And what we do not want to do in the church is domesticate people, but that is what we can tend to do if we are not intentionally thinking, how do we help people continue to take steps of faith, take risk, go out there and take bold steps, that there's something that is scary about sharing the gospel with somebody, or maybe you feel like the Lord's stirring you to make some other step of faith, like to foster kids, or to, I don't know what it might be. And it'd be scary. And if we aren't careful, we can create a culture that makes that seem okay. That's like, we should have a culture that's like, yes, go for it. Like, hey, I tried something in faith. It didn't go as I thought, but man, praise the Lord. Like, he is good. And to have time to share like, that's one thing I think is helpful, is like time to share testimonies of steps of faith. Hey, what have you seen God doing this week? It hopefully stirs faith. Rob, what else have you seen as far as like seeing people step out into the wild, take risks?
Yeah, I remember in San Francisco when I was there, it was maybe a year after they had started We Are Church, and it was very normal that every Sunday after the gathering, we'd go out and knock on doors and meet our neighbors and get rejected a whole bunch. San Francisco is not really like like a Christian Bible Belt place. It's like nobody really wants Jesus, it seems like here. So, but it was good for people that were transfer growth, that were coming from other states or churches, and they were joining We Are Church, to realize that we're not just going to sit here every week and consume. We're actually going to go out and share and take steps of faith to pray for people and look for opportunities to share the gospel. That was a regular rhythm. Like, it was really, really helpful for the church, because you had people that had been part of the family of God, different churches all over the world for years, and had never shared the gospel, never, and just didn't even have a inclination to do so, because they thought their job was just to invite people to church and that the pastor would do that. So it was a shift for them and an activation that would actually happen. So that was good. Now, here I am, maybe close to 11 years later, in a different city in East Palo Alto, and trying to implement some of those same things as leaders here, as the elders have said, wow, we've have this amazing just church with people that are just gifted and robust in theology, and they're just ripe, people, but we're missing this part of engagement in the Great Commission, like going out and actually making disciples of all the nations like Jesus told us to. So now we're creating a rhythm of third Tuesday, every 3 Tuesday, we go out, all of the churches, and we go out and knock on doors and invite them into a community barbecue the following week. So we're trying to start that again, because we kind of stopped doing it. Doesn't mean that no churches were sharing the gospel or people weren't sharing with their coworkers or at school or at work. We just stopped doing it together as a family. So those are some simple steps that we're trying to take to reignite that flame of evangelism and going out. Um, and then, mercy ministry is a big one too. I think that's been really helpful to activate people. God's people have always been known for being generous and compassionate and loving, and especially when it comes to the poor. And that's one of our values as well. But taking people out to serve and cook food, and then go out and distribute it and love on people and pray for people. Those are some ways that we've taken steps of faith and try to get people activated in that. It's funny because sometimes, like I maybe like last year, I was doing a shelter ministry, going to the shelter every week, and I take my son with me. We'd cook some food, and then eventually I started taking one of the guys from our church, and man, he just loved it. He was so encouraged, and he just wanted to go every time. And then eventually I was like, wow, this guy really likes this a lot. And so I started pulling away. And now that guy does that ministry himself. He goes there and he takes other people from the church. It wasn't like a planned out thing for me. It was just like spending time with him and inviting him into relationship and going to serve. But now that's kind of God is using him, and I've pulled out of there and I'm somewhere else doing some other ministries. So activating people, inviting them as you go is really important to take steps of faith because they come to life. Your people are, I really believe that God put something inside of all of us. Like if we have Christ in us and like he's the chief apostle, he is the evangelist, he is the witness, he's the everything, then if he's in us, then he'll manifest himself in the body like that. So I believe that each believer has something inside of them that longs to live that part of Christ out in them, so to express Christ everywhere. Um, yeah, is that helpful? I think, I'll stop there. I know I'm going long, but
No, that's great. Yeah, and I think of as you're sharing that, for me as somebody who's, I would say, not one of my primary gifts is the evangelist of Ephesians 4. I think for people who are in that boat, there's probably a lot of our pastors, leaders, and others who are listening to this that where you go, I don't know if that's like one of my primary gifts. So what do I do in light of that? Because if you have that gifting, that impulse to like be going out constantly, that's really helpful in creating this culture. And if you don't, I think one thing I've learned is I really need to, kind of like I was talking about earlier, make sure it's not centered on me. If the church is centered on me and you're leading too much, it's going to be very tailored to your specific gift set, right? Like church is going to take on too much of your flavor, right? You want your character, your leadership, your oversight should be like setting a strong tone, but your gifting should not be the primary or only gifting within the body. We have to know how to raise up others and to let others lead. And so there's a couple of people in my church that I know have a strong gifting in evangelism, and I've encouraged them in that. But I think I've not done a good enough job of really empowering them and getting behind them. I need to do more of that. So I think that's like a step of obedience for me. And hopefully, as people are listening, you're trying to think like, what are some steps of obedience for me in this? How do you champion those leaders? How do you, even if you recognize it's not your gifting, you see biblically, this is really important. So what does it look like for you to allow others to step into that? And don't, and what's easy is to go like, oh, you have that gifting, like, that's awesome. Yeah. Oh, you want to do an outreach? Oh, that's really cool. That's great. But are you gonna, like, where I know I have not been faithful is like I haven't showed up enough to those things. I need to show up. I need to model it. I need to help like really like I guess encourage those gifts. So those are a couple thoughts. As far as specifically, and maybe last point that will be a question to Rob. We need to be thinking about like very tangibly in equipping. Do the people in the church know how to share the gospel? Is like a very tangible question. And do people in the church know what to do next if someone is interested? So I guess Rob, maybe just to take a little time, what should leaders in We Are Church do with those questions if they feel like they aren't sure? Are there resources, tools, things you could give?
yeah, I mean, again, I think relationship and time is going to be very valuable, probably more valuable than we can understand right now. Like I was talking with Francis the other day about this, and he's using the example of like how discipleship kind of happens, not just like coffee breaks or coffee meetings and stuff like that, but doing life together. So I think that's the primary, really, relationship, relationship, relationship. But I think there should be some of those questions should be answered. Do we should ask ourselves, do people in our church really know how to share the gospel? Everybody. And you'll probably find out that not everybody does. They may know what the gospel is. Some may not even understand what the gospel is. So doing a training on what the gospel is and how to share it is really easy. There's some document that Justin made a long time ago that I've used over and over again in trainings, like, why the gospel, what the gospel is, and how to share it, and who should share it. And it's just a page, but just those topics alone, if you go through those four, it's really helpful. So I'd say taking your church through a simple training. And if there's other tools that maybe other people have used or have in your body that have helped them, there's so much out there that you can use. And it's very basic. I would say take your people through that type of stuff. Um, other tools, I think, besides that, books. I keep this book around a lot because I reference it a lot, but it's really helped me. It's called The Master's Plan of Evangelism. And this would be a good book to go through with not just leaders, but with your church to understand Jesus, at least a perspective on Jesus's methodology of discipleship, the Master's Plan. So this talks about discipleship, not just evangelism. And they both are very much connected. Another tool that I've used and given to people, even my son Jerry, is the Purple Book. This is a helpful book for discipleship, for covering the basics. Sometimes in our gatherings and we're a church, you kind of know what to expect. You come in, you pray, you read, you share from the reading plan, and then you take communion, and then you talk about each other's lives and situations and how you can help one another. And then you have a meal together, which is really cool. Highly relational, good time for the one another's. But you sometimes maybe you have to drop in some teachings or trainings throughout the week and make space for those to happen so that you are equipping people and they're getting opportunities, like I said, by going out together. It's just, you don't have to have a poor neighborhood. I mean, I think sometimes people get stuck on, well, I don't live in the ghetto. We live in a nice part of town. What we've done in those situations, just go to the mall and just walk around and break up in twos and say, hey, we're walking around praying for people. Can I pray for you? And meet people. Those opportunities are going to be golden, and then deep refeed with people. So those are some tools, but I would imagine that some of you guys as leaders have been trained or somebody's walked you through some tools or exercises. Use those, but use something. Use something and don't just assume that people have been trained or know how or what the gospel is. Don't assume that. I think that's probably my biggest encouragement is don't assume and then do the little work of, doing it or else empowering one of the people in your church that's really passionate about it, like Sean's saying, to do it for you guys. Doesn't have to be like a top notch, high level training. God's going to work through all kinds of different methodologies. It's just really making sure you're doing it.
That's good. Yeah, and the only last thought I had was, um, as you're giving those resources, like one conversation that's helpful to have within the church is, what does it look like for somebody who is interested in Jesus? Like, what is, I think that's like just a very tangible conversation that is helpful to have in the church, because people will often wonder, like, do I invite them into the gathering? Like, because, this is a small, intimate space. They might be overwhelmed by that. What should I do with somebody who I met, who's a neighbor? And just being able to have some vision for that as a local church. And I've found every situation is different, but it might be something just to have a helpful conversation around to know what are next steps and what would it look like for somebody to start a Bible study in their own home that, or I don't know what is the encouragement, like how, like what is the plan for bringing people, integrating them into the body. So those are really helpful conversations. Hopefully you got some different thoughts that are helpful and you can come out with some action steps for leading in the church. All right. Well, we are now on our third practice of We Are Church, and we've been going through the values, or sorry, I said practice.